I know what you're thinking. Surely this argument is about war, it's about the laws of war, about international relations, but I've not really shown what it has to do with police. I've not really talked about police war, as my title has it. Let me move to this through the work of that classical bourgeois liberal John Locke, and by returning to the point I have hinted at a couple of times already, namely punishment. The chapter on the state of nature at the beginning of Locke's second treatise is regarded as one of the classic chapters in the history of political thought, outlining as it does the liberal case for natural rights. What is interesting is that the key question dealt with by Locke in the chapter concerns the right of punishment. To justify such a right, the simplest claim would have been to say that it is derived from the limited rights of citizens over others once political society has been created, and derived from the doctrine of consent, which Locke articulates elsewhere in the treatise. But making this claim would have meant Locke abandoning the doctrine that he wishes to hold. Now, this is a doctrine which he several times admits is strange, but which he takes from other earlier liberals, such as Grotius. The doctrine in question is that there is a natural right to punish. This natural right to punish exists, quote, to secure men from the attempts of a criminal, says Locke. And he adds that it is necessary because the criminal has renounced reason and become a savage beast equivalent to a lion or a tiger. Now, in this context, Locke makes an important claim. He adds that such beasts such as the lion, the tiger, and the criminal, have to be understood as having, quote, declared war against all mankind. In other words, with the criminal, as with the lion and the tiger, peace and security are impossible. So the criminal is at war with society and vice versa. So the arguments concerning punishment and war are deeply connected in classical liberalism, in a way which conjures up an image of a social body saturated by war. Why? Because Locke is in fact concerned with the continued existence of criminality following the creation of political society, and not just in the state of nature. And with the creation of political society, the insecurity generated by the criminal is intensified by the creation of money. Money is necessary, says Locke, but because it consolidates the centrality of private property, it intensifies the range of crimes possible, and as a consequence, the general levels of enmity. So the existence of criminality within society and the intensification of criminality following the creation of money mean that political power is in some sense understood by classical liberalism as a permanent war against the criminal and in defense of private property. In addition, make three observations. First, Locke's comments on the colonial situation are similarly mapped out in terms of the doctrine of punishment as war. Because European colonists possess the right to execute the law of nature, any resistance by indigenous peoples to the exercise of this right is a crime and an act of war. And against such a crime and act of war, colonial powers have the right to fight back. And the outcome is a more or less permanent war against the colonized. Second, for Locke, the condition of the slave is the condition of being property rather than owning property. Because slaves have no property, they are outside the social contract and therefore under a form of despotic rule. And yet Locke also claims that despotic rule is a state of war. Moreover, although Locke suggests that the slave is outside of civil society, the bulk of his argument presupposes the place of the slave within civil society through the slave's place within the household which owns the slave. Thus, the state of war that is slavery rumbles on through any civil society which allows slavery. And third, Locke believed that slave resistance is not only illegal, but is also an unjust rebellion. And any unjust rebellion is a form of war. Locke suggests that, quote, those who have set up force in opposition to the laws bring back again the state of war and are properly rebels, end quote. This is an idea common among the theorists of the ruling class. Hobbes, for example, suggests that, quote, rebellion is war renewed. And Algernon Sidney points out that, quote, rebellion signifies no more than to renew a war. What all of this means, as I hope you can see, is that for the ruling class, rebellion by the propertyless at home is equivalent to rebellion by slaves and indigenous colonial subjects. It is war. And what we have is the foundation of the argument about the necessity of the state in bourgeois ideology. The state is necessary because of the permanent warfare that resonates through the social order. Or, to put that another way, one which will help me to bring this argument up to date, the state is engaged in permanent war against the universal adversary, the rebellious slaves, antagonistic Indians, disgruntled workers, and of course the criminal disorderly rebel. Liberal government, constituted supposedly for the peace and security of capitalism, turns out to be nothing less than a permanent exercise of the war power against the enemies of capital. Seen through the lens of sovereignty, the universal adversary is the enemy of security. Seen through the lens of property, the universal adversary is the enemy of accumulation. Seen through the lens of police, it is the enemy of order. Liberal sovereignty is constituted for this war against this enemy, and from a liberal perspective, this war is the just war. And yet at the same time, liberalism will constantly hold back from calling it war. It is thus in many ways the secret war of bourgeois history, which is precisely why it is so often conducted through the police power. For the logic within liberal ideology is that if we call it police, then it can't be war. This is why the dichotomy of war and police is so important to liberal ideology, and is equally why we as radicals need to think of war and police as together, as a unity, and not as a dichotomy. It is because the lawless creature is at war with the social order, a war carried out as a police operation, that punishment and war are so closely connected in the bourgeois mind. This connection between punishment and war is the reason why the punishment of death is so important to liberalism. And I want to just say a few words about this to close my speech. Let me start with that classical liberal theorist of crime and punishment, Beccaria. Beccaria is regarded as one of the first major liberal thinkers on punishment. He offers the classical liberal Enlightenment statement condemning torture, for example. But look at what he says about the death penalty. He's at great pains to show that the state cannot claim any right to the death penalty. The death penalty, he says, is not a right. Okay, but if it's not a right, what is it? Beccaria makes his point in a short passage which I will read for the point about death. But while I read it, you should also note the central police concepts of order and security that run through this passage. This is Beccaria. First, if he being the criminal, first, if he still has sufficient connections and such power that he can threaten the security of the nation, even though he be deprived of his liberty, if his mere existence can produce a revolution dangerous to the established form of government, then his death is required. The death of such a citizen becomes necessary then when the nation is losing or recovering its liberty, or in times of anarchy, when disorder itself takes the place of law. End quote. In other words, and this is Beccaria again, the death penalty is, quote, a war of the nation against a citizen, a campaign waged on the ground that the nation has judged the destruction of his being to be useful or necessary, end quote. All of which is to point out why punishment is so important to the police power, but also to suggest that punishment is one of the factors that connects police and war in the bourgeois mind. Police, war, punishment, the core nexus of bourgeois violence and capitalist order. This is why we have to pay attention when we are told that disorder has broken out, because it means that the open warfare against the universal adversary is about to be intensified. And maybe this is why politicians are always ready to see disorder breaking out, because they always look for the moment when they can exercise the sovereign power to kill. The declaration of lawlessness is what opens the door to death at the hands of the state. And maybe, and you will have to forgive me for there are many maybes as I come to close the speech, but I'm offering these maybes as a way of provoking some discussion about ruling class violence. Maybe part of the violence and the cruelty comes from killing citizens at the very moment of disorder. The state has always claimed the power to take people away and give them back dead. That's the death penalty. But sometimes it does not even bother to take them away in the first place. Sometimes it just kills them on the spot, in the war zone in which the battles are being fought by the police power. maybe even the killing of children in these moments of revolt and rebellion, a child that may or may not have been taking part in the revolt, or may not have been going to buy some bread, and for the state, it does not really matter whether that child was rebelling or buying bread, because at the moment of rebellion, even buying bread can be seen as disorderly. Maybe such killings are part of the violence that the state feels obliged to carry out to win its war against the masses. We know that murder in its many guises is one of the products of capital, in which the crimes committed by corporations resulting in the deaths of thousands of workers go unpunished. Deaths at work are almost always the result of companies avoiding health and safety measures, usually because the state is not concerned about having proper safety measures to protect workers. But murder is also one of the products of the police power. It is a product that the state does not wish us to discuss. But if you want a sense of the extent of this murder rate, you can note that in the US, since the end of 2001, over 5,000 people have been killed by the police. In other words, the number of dead killed by the police power in the US since 2001 far outnumbers the dead killed by the universal adversary in the same period, even if we include the 3,000 killed by terrorists on 11th of September that year. We hear a lot these days about the terrible force that murdered 3,000 on that day, and we are constantly told that we must not forget. But as radicals, as critical theorists, as Marxists, we are surely also obliged to keep on talking about the power that murders many, often members of the universal adversary. And we must also surely never forget these either, not least because we are part of that universal adversary. Those deaths are the victims of a war, a police war carried out in the name of peace and security, a police war in the name of law and order, a police war against the universal adversary. Thank you very much for listening.
I'd like to thank Mark on behalf of all of us. Now we are going to continue with Adam Geary. Sorry about that. Yeah, don't worry. I would like to give a couple of points about Adam's background. He's a professor of law at the University of London, Birkbeck. His research interests lie in political philosophy and literary jurisprudence. He works on political justice. He's also he's completing some British Academy funding projects. One of them is a collection of essays co-edited with Marinos Diamantides on Islam, law and identity. The other one is the study of law and American radicalism. In literary jurisprudence, his concerns are with deconstruction, the primordial grounds of law and poetics. See where the law touches on may affirm the Cardozo-Logia review. He's one of his work published in 2005 was about this. And here is his most recent books are Justice and Welfare, Equity and Solidarity, came out on 2012. The Politics of the Common Law, Perspective, Rights, Processes, Institutions. It produced with Wayne Morrison and Robert Jago in 2008. There's another one came out 2005, Globalization and Law, Trade Rights and War, with Kostas Boudinas. His general interest, academic interest, can be defined as post-colonialism, literary jurisprudence, deconstruction, and Marxism. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Could I just begin by seconding what Mark has just said, and that is that it's such an honour to be here, to be able to talk to you today. Is that better? Yeah, everybody okay? Louder, okay. And also to thank the organisers for putting together such a wonderful event. The starting point of my paper, and I think I want to do this because it's a rather dense paper. It's a difficult paper. So I want to start really by trying to outline to you what the major points of my argument are.
I hate to apologize, but you have to keep your distance stable.
I could hold it up.
If you can.
Yeah, okay.
And also the same distance. Yeah.
Okay, like that. Is that okay? Is that working?
Adam, you can.
Continue. Yeah, okay. Okay, so let me just say briefly how I'm going to outline my argument. And I think the main point that I want to make, and I'll say this right at the beginning in case I run out of time, and I think it picks up as well on some of the things that Mark was talking about a moment ago. I think if I had to say what my main point is, it would be as follows. Radicals and progressives may need to understand that law and the state are stand-ins, reified concepts, prosthetics, if you will. Ways of thinking about and articulating something. Well, what? What I want to hint at in this paper is, if you like, a critical principle. A critical principle which may allow us to think about this something, this what. A critical principle that can be drawn from the work of Marx. And let me just, as I say, in a way that is unexplained at the moment, suggest that this something, this what, this critical principle, which can allow us a foundation, perhaps, to think about the law and the state, could be described as something like ethical life, or obviously it's a concept in Hegel's phenomenology of mind, Sittlichkeit in the German, ethical life. I'm going to translate it as ethical life. And the basis of one of the other main points in my argument is that we need to find within Marx's work an account of ethical life that is linked to the critique of political economy, that is linked to the critique of capitalism. That's the argument in a nutshell, in its simplest form, if you like. What I wanted to do next is to just try and outline the moves that I want to make in this argument. And again, I apologize, it's a rather dense paper, it's a rather abstract and theoretical paper, but I think my intention here is to do just this, to try and get at, in the sense of, if you like, political philosophy, a possible starting point, a philosophical starting point. But I think once one reads Marx properly, this idea of philosophy is precisely one that we also need to think critically about. I think that's one of my sub-themes. I'll come back to that as I go along. So, what I wanted to do right now is just outline what I see as the main ways in which I want to build this argument. What I will do after that is try and direct our attention to some of the key ideas in a slightly more detailed way. But as I say, I wanted to do this to hopefully outline, I think, the terms, the fighting terms of this argument, the way in which I want to connect together a number of concepts to get at this point that ethical life, Marx doesn't really have a concept of ethical life, let me say that in parentheses, to get at the way in which a possible concept of ethical life that one may be able to find within Marx is linked to the critique of political economy. That's the argument that I now want to elaborate, set out in a little more detail. So, whilst my paper says nothing directly about law and the state, it is an attempt to work out some themes drawn from Marx and Hegel that might enable an account of the law and state in modern jurisprudence, the philosophy of law, in other words. The paper begins really with just an engagement with a single text of Marx's, and that is the 1844 manuscripts, also called the Paris manuscripts or the Paris notebook. So that's the only text of Marx that I want to talk about is this text. And obviously, sorry, this is another digression. For readers of Marx, obviously the Paris manuscripts are a strange text, an unfinished text. To me, a text pregnant with possibility, pregnant with ways in which Marx was even perhaps reading himself, offering various ways of putting together concepts. There's an unfinished quality that Althusser drew attention to, amongst others, to the Paris manuscripts, which to me makes it a very important text in this kind of thinking. So, the starting point within the Paris manuscripts is Marx's idea of species being, in German Gattungswesen. If you know this text, you'll know that this is linked to the questions that Marx is dealing with in that text around alienation and work. My argument, and again I hope I can outline some of these themes in a little more detail, is that these arguments about species being, work and alienation need to be linked to arguments about sense or meaning. Human sense, human meaning. So in summary, species being relates to work. It raises in Marx's language, or at least the English translation, the question of the essence of man, clearly a difficult concept, a problematic concept. The more usual interpretation of species being is that it relates to alienation and work. I'm taking that theme, and I'm trying to link it to the theme of sense or meaning as a way of moving towards some appropriation of the notion of ethical life. The Hegelian concept from Hegel, that Marx is using in the Paris manuscripts. I think what Marx is doing in the Paris manuscripts, with these references towards Hegel's concept of ethical life, is to use them, to distort them, if you like, to change them, and to use them as a way of reading Adam Smith. Now, if you remember again the layout, the organisation, the Paris manuscripts, what Marx is doing, and it's a strange move. It's a strange move. He's reading Hegel, he's reading German idealism, as it were, in and against, I suppose we would now say, political economy. Sorry, well, strictly Adam Smith's works. So my suggestion is that in Marx's attempt to read Adam Smith through Hegel, we get the beginning points of how a Marxist understanding of ethical life may be imaginable. And in the most interesting way, I think this takes us back to work and alienation, because the engagement with Adam Smith in the Paris notebooks concerns wages, conditions of work, themes that Marx elaborates in a very interesting way, in a way that takes me back to my concern with sense and meaning. So what I want to do just now is go to, I think, one of the key paragraphs in the Paris manuscripts. I'd like to read it to you. I'm thinking there might even have been a Turkish translation of this provided. I'm not sure. That I was talking to the translators at lunchtime. This is, I think, an important paragraph, and I think within this paragraph is contained almost everything that I want to say. It's obviously it's a translation, it's in English, it's written in German. But let me just read it to you and see what we think about this paragraph. So it begins, it's a quotation. When communist artisans associate with one another, theory, propaganda, etc., is their first end. But at the same time, as a result of this association, they require a new need, the need for society. And what appears as a means becomes an end. In this practical process, the most splendid results are to be observed whenever French socialist workers are seen together. Such things as smoking, drinking, eating, etc., are no longer means of contact or means that bring them together. Association, society, and conversation, which again has association at its end, are enough for them. The brotherhood of man is no mere phrase with them, it's a fact of life. And the nobility of man shines upon us from their work-hardened bodies. A great deal could be said about this paragraph. Marx is an incredible writer, stylist. What, for a philosophical piece, we have this strange poetic invocation at the end of it. The nobility of man shines upon us from their work-hardened bodies. The nobility, an abstract concept, that what it means to be noble, is linked with something sensuous, empirical, if you will. The way in which a body looks with the sun shining on it. Something shines forth. It's about appearance. I mean, as you, again, I suppose if you are familiar with Hegel's work, this whole idea of essence and appearance is very important. So I think within Marx's reading of this text, within Marx's work on Hegel, these philosophical categories, if you like, philosophical ideas, are also at work, working alongside this very immediate, poetic evocation of people smoking, drinking, eating, hanging out together. That's rather like today. The point that I want to stress in terms of the more formal development of my argument at this point is that I think what Marx is saying here is something about the meaning of work, the meaning of work, the sense of work. It lies, this meaning, this sense, smoking, eating, drinking, talking, laughing, this meaning that lies, if one is to find it, if it can even be found, lies in association between workers, lies in what we could call sensuous practices, ways of doing things, ways of being together, ways of talking with each other. That, I think, is the link that I want to try and build, and I want to try and link that idea of what Marx is describing here, this source of meaning, this source of sense, which comes out of being together. I want to link that to Marx's account of species being, of what Marx means by this quite peculiar concept, which actually does fall out of his work. It's clearly it's important in the Paris manuscripts, but it becomes less important as Marx continues his writing. It clearly doesn't play any really significant role in Capital, although perhaps the shadow of the concept is there in Capital as well. The point that I think I want to link this to, and I'm saying this primarily for the translators or anybody following the text of this argument. Again, I want to read another piece of the Paris manuscripts. It's on page 5 of my manuscript. It's the quotation, second paragraph from the top, if you are translating this. It's another, I think perhaps more focused, philosophical explanation, elaboration of that earlier paragraph. I'd like to read this to you and then try again to make this link between work and sense and species being, to just try and get at what we've already heard, what we've already in a sense been thinking about when Marx describes the French socialist workers associating together. So here is, this is, as I say, on the manuscript, it's the quotation from Marx, second paragraph from the top. I want to just try and read this out quite slowly and then suggest an interpretation of this passage, which takes us back to the interpretation of species being in sense. Quote, "When man confronts himself he confronts the other man. What applies to a man's relation to his work, to the product of his labour, and to himself, also holds of a man's relation to the other man, and to the other man's labour, an object of labour. In fact, the proposition that man's species being is estranged, alienated if you like, from him, means that one man is estranged from the other, as each of them is from man's essential nature. The estrangement of man, and in fact every relationship in which man stands to himself, is realised and expressed only in the relationship in which a man stands to other men.